Krishnan, you've been presenting Channel 4 News now for, 19 years?
19 and a half, it'll be 20 in June.
And still counting. A long time in television terms. It's a highly successful programme. As Peter said, it's sometimes a fun programme, but it's certainly a devastatingly successful news programme. RTS News Programme of the Year, multiple RTS awards. You've been on the inside for quite some time. What's the secret of its success?
I think there's a few things. I think fundamentally it's a programme with a really strong sense of what it is. And by that I mean the team, and it's a team, some of which that changes and some of which just stays the same. I remember when I first arrived looking around and people had been there for 10, 15 years, and I thought, have I made a terrible mistake? Once you come here you can't ever leave. But then I soon realised why people stick around on Channel 4 News, and it is because it's a great fun place where we all kind of have a sense of what it is we're there to do. So we've got quite a sort of strong sense of our duty, our mission. I remember a few years ago, and during one of our many relaunches, our bosses wanted us to come up with a mission statement, and we just kind of thought it was the most stupid thing in the world, because we all knew what our mission was. And we all know what we're there to do, and it's basically to cause trouble and expose things and get up people's noses and have a sense of fun while you're doing it, but sort of hold truth to power and all of that. And so I think that very strong identity is the secret, and then a constant sense of curiosity and renewal, whereby we are constantly thinking, or have been in the 20 years that I've been there. How are we doing it? Are we doing it right? Are we relevant? Are we communicating in the right way? How do we spread the message in different ways on social media or on the internet or however it might be? And trying to think about that and not ossify and not just be stuck in time as this great product.
I've heard it described as news with attitude. Is that?
I think there's a bit of attitude. Yeah, I think that's fair. It's
What's
sort of
the
news.
attitude?
The attitude is a mixture of, suspiciousness and trying to get to the truth, whatever that might be. Trying to hold power to account is I'm going to say that lots of times because that's really I think that's the big reason why we're there. And revealing things. I think the attitude of Channel 4 News is not to follow the pack, not to do the same stories as everybody else, not to just, have the news agenda driven by this juggernaut of newspapers, websites, and other TV programmes, and to try and think ourselves about what we think is important.
Do you think you can do things that, say, the BBC 10 o'clock news can't do?
I think the BBC 10 o'clock news could do anything that we do. But I think the difference between being a relatively small and nimble operation like Channel 4 News and being a massive news juggernaut like the 10 o'clock news at the sort of the top of this huge super tanker of thousands of people is that there are layers and layers and layers of managers, layers and layers and layers of decision makers, and if you really want to do anything difficult, it's a bit harder, I think. Whereas with us, there's only sort of 3 people between me and the chief executive of Channel 4. If I want to give her a ring, I basically can. So it's easier, I think, to get things done.
Are you a campaigning programme?
No, I don't think we are a campaigning programme. No, I think
we
might get
the stuff
the bits.
You were doing on homelessness before and over Christmas. That seemed pretty close to campaigning.
I can see what you mean by that. But I think depends what you mean by campaigning. I think what we might do is we might say, as the programme did before Christmas, and I wasn't really involved in any of that, to be honest, but I think it's quite a good thing to say, before Christmas we're going to shine a light on something, and we're going to do it relentlessly for 10 days or however long that season was. And we do have seasons, where we say we're going to look at homelessness, or we're going to look at India, or we're going to look at Brexit, or we're going to look at whatever it might be, and we'll do a sort of a series of themes. And that's not intended to campaign for any one particular thing. It's not that we're campaigning for a change in the law or any specific thing. We're just shining a light on something in a concentrated way. And I can see with that particular one, I think with homelessness, you might think, has this become Shelter on the Telly? But I don't think it was. I think it was just telling people's stories.
Right.
and trying to make people think about it.
Okay. Jon Snow. I believe you know him.
Reasonably well. We've sat either across the table from each other or
What's
next
he
to each
like
other
to work
for
with?
20 years. He's very much like he is on the telly.
Good no. Really?
Yeah. He's tremendously enthusiastic, a little bit chaotic, and full of energy, and talks a lot. I often correct him on his own stories, because I've heard them many. I could have written that book. People often say, "Have you read his book?" I could have bloody written it. No, he's great. There's a lot of. I don't think there's a lot of affection. I think between me and Jon, and I hope that comes out on the telly.
When you started, you were how old when you started in Channel 4? 28?
28, yeah.
Yeah. So you must have sort of sat there and thought, I've got a lot to learn. What do you think you learnt most from him?
I think the thing that Jon has that is really special is empathy with the people he's reporting on. It's more a reporting thing than a presenting thing, I think, to be honest.
Yeah.
Because I think the unique thing about Channel 4 News is that all the presenters are reporters. So we go out, we still tell stories, we get sent to big stories around the world, and we make the packages. We don't just present and do interviews. And I think what I really got from Jon is sort of seeing him in big disasters and floods and earthquakes and that kind of thing, and seeing how he relates to people. And having come from the BBC, where I'd spent 10 years at the BBC before I went to Channel 4, and I think I was in the BBC mould. I'd grown up, if you like, with Martin Bell and Jeremy Bowen and John Simpson, and seeing them doing it, which is brilliant in its own way, but is I think a little bit more separated from the subject. And I think what I saw with Jon is an ability to reach out to people on the ground and tell their stories and empathise with them in a way that doesn't necessarily mean that you are taking their side editorially, but you are understanding their problems. And I think I probably have learned from that, and not copied it, but I think in my own way I've had a chance to explore that with Unreported World, which is a documentary series that I do. Talking nonsense. If you're a brilliant man, and he is, a certain proportion of the things that you say will just be nonsense, and that's definitely the case with Jon.
Right. Okay. When I think it was in 2011, there was quite a change to the presentation team of Channel 4. Kathy Newman came in.
Yeah.
Matt Fry came in some of the time, etc. Before that, it had been very much sort of Jon Snow with Krishnan Guru-Murthy, and it looked as though it became much more of a sort of, here's the Channel 4 News team. And a lot of people said to me that they thought that was to your benefit, really, because you became, at that point, almost a presenter in your own right, whereas often before you'd sort of been seen as Jon's sidekick. Do you recognise that about yourself?
I think, it's interesting people say that. To be honest, no, because I think I had the... I came in, right at the beginning with them saying, you'll be doing it when Jon's not there, basically.
Yeah.
So I ended up presenting that programme as in that old format of the main presenter and a sidekick. A lot, 60, 70, 80 days a year. And as much as a Newsnight presenter or whatever it would. So I found it relatively easy to sort of establish myself as my own person.
Right.
And then doing other programmes as well sort of helps that. But I think going more double-headed, there's still a sort of a hierarchy, but we are more double-headed than we've ever been.
Jon is still first among equals.
Jon's still top dog.
Yeah.
And there is a main presenter and a second presenter, but it's less obvious.
Yeah.
And that's certainly evened up the roles. But I personally haven't felt that differently about it, to be honest.
Right.
Because I've never been one of those people who count what they're doing each day. My aim is, in a year, have I had some great programs? Have I told some good stories? Have I done some great interviews? And I always got a chance to do that because Jon wouldn't be there, and I'd be top dog for a few days. So I didn't particularly consciously feel that the change in format made a big difference to me.
You started in television very young. I think you started appearing regularly at about age 18, something like that.
I got my first job at 18, yes.
Yes, okay. I think we've got a little clip
Oh, God.
of you at that time.
And in a way that just makes me crack up every time.
In your column in The Listener, of course, now you advised Neil Kinnock on how to deal with Mrs. Thatcher in the Commons. Was that after a desire to see Mrs. Thatcher defeated in the Commons?
Yes, and also a desire for fair play. I mean, I think Kinnock is a very articulate and intelligent man, but I think he doesn't have to give a performance in the Commons that would show him off at his best.
Isn't it something of a condemnation of him if he has to be advised on how to be witty, on how to be dynamic in his speech making?
It depends what you look for in a politician. If you want a politician who is simply extremely witty and clever and good at making remarks in the House of Commons, then I suppose it is. But if you want a politician who actually has a grasp of the needs of the country and the way to be a politician, which is not to be a comedian, then I don't think it's condemnation at all.
And do you think he has?
Personally, I do. I think he has them in abundance, yes. But then it may be that all one's looking for in a politician now is a sort of PR suit.
Yes.
Even in those days, you were a pretty persistent. How did that come about?
Well, that programme was deliberately a bear pit. It was called Open to Question, and it used to invite groups of teenagers from about 15 to 18 to grill public figures and politicians. And it was a deliberately serious, bear pit in which the audience were told, go for it. And I was one of those kids when I was 15 who was in the audience, and I kept getting invited back because they realised that I would always have a question to ask. So I became a bit of a banker in the audience. If it dried up, they could always just go Krishnan, and I'd have something to say.
Even in those days.
So I did about 8 of them in the audience, and then I wrote to the BBC. I was going to go off and be a medic, like my dad, and took a year off between school and university and wrote to the BBC in Scotland where that programme was made and asked them if I could come and work for them as a researcher in my year off, and they said no, because you're a child, and but you can come do some work experience if you like. And so they invited me up for 2 weeks work experience on a daytime show that they were making up there. And at the end of that 2 weeks, in which I'd put in loads of ideas and made a nuisance of myself generally, the head of department actually took me out for a walk and said, what do you want to do? Are you interested in a career in television? And I said, well, I'm going off to medical school, but, I've always sort of vaguely had an eye on applying for the BBC training scheme. And he said, well, I want to screen test you. And he put me in the studio and made me do an interview with the previous presenter of that programme, John Nicholson, and offered me a 2-series contract. And that was the week before my A-level results.
It was quite a training ground, wasn't it? Because John Nicholson was there, of course, who went on to become an MP and did breakfast.
Yeah.
I think Sarah Smith was one of the regulars.
Sarah was also in the audience,
Yes,
so
right,
I've known Sarah since I was 16, yes.
Yep. So, you started there, then you went to university to Oxford, but you kept on appearing on TV. As a student, you worked for the BBC Asian programme Network East 2 days a week. And then in your final year, your tutor told you to buckle down and get a degree. So, to buckle down, you decided to do Newsround on a part-time basis during the holidays.
Yeah. Well, I quit. I was told you've got to stop, so I stopped doing what I was doing, which was making programmes for the BBC's Asian Programmes Unit, which doesn't exist anymore, much to the BBC's loss. And so, but then literally a week before my third year at Oxford, Newsround rang up and said, we're looking for a new presenter, and why don't you come in, because you could just do it in your holidays, basically, and then go full-time. So I went in and saw them, and they said, yeah, okay, fine. Oxford terms are only 8-week terms, so for most of the year you are available. And so I worked during my vacations and then went full-time when I left. And so I did break it a little bit, so I ended up going to cover the Croatian War, I think 6 weeks before my finals, which wasn't very sensible. But it was great fun, And I did all sorts of mad things. I went and interviewed. I covered the Pakistani elections, and I interviewed the Sri Lankan president, and all these sorts of crazy things for the thing I was doing before, which meant that I could quote them in my. I studied South Asian politics as one of my papers, and could write really obnoxious essays about sort of in private conversation. Benazir Bhutto says,
I got a quote from you. I used to look at David Dimbleby and think I can do that. You weren't a young man lacking in self-confidence.
Well, I had that 18-year-old confidence of thinking I could do anything.
Arrogance?
Yeah, Yeah, a bit. But I mean, I've never really worried about. I quite like arrogance in other people, to be honest. And
Really?
I like meeting arrogant young people in the media who kind of think they can do it all, because the truth is you probably can. The media, people my age conspire to tell young people that they can't do it, and it's very hard. You need years and years of experience. I'm not sure you do, and I wasn't sure then either. I thought, well, I didn't think I could do it today, but I looked at it and thought, well, yeah, I could do that. I mean, and I think it's, as you get older and as you do more of it, you realise how difficult it is and how little you know about things, and so you become less and less confident, more and more insecure, even when you've been doing something for 20 years. I mean, John's still insecure.
Aren't all presenters?
All presenters are insecure to some degree, but at the time, I had that confidence of thinking I could do it all, and so that meant that I wasn't scared of my first program. I mean, my first programs were on that Open to Question program. We did on the same day. We did John Prescott in the morning and Jimmy Savile in the afternoon, or maybe it was the other way around. But anyway,
What did you think of Savile?
Savile was horrible, and it was very, very immediately obvious. And in fact, we ran a big chunk of the Savile programme on Channel 4 News, taken off YouTube, because I didn't even have a copy of it myself, because it was very revealing, even then, about his attitude towards sex and morality. And he used to, we forget that he did actually used to brag in his tabloid interviews and his tabloid world about the number of people he'd slept with and his attitude towards girls. And the kids really took him on it and just, asked him very straightforward questions about his sexual morality and how he squared that with his image. And he didn't have very good answers. He was quite odious. And afterwards, actually, he went to the Sun newspaper and sort of did a preemptive strike on the programme to say, this group of kids had been primed to have a go at me, and this was terrible BBC behaviour and all the rest of it.
And of course he had George Carman watching his back, just in case anybody thought about printing anything as well.
Yeah.
So you were presenting regularly at TV at 18, you'd made it to Channel 4 News at 28. Do you ever look back and think, have I had it a bit easy?
I mean, I know when I talk about how I got my jobs, it sounds like I had it very easy. I just got offered this and I got offered that and then I got offered something else. And so maybe I have, maybe I think I probably have been very right place, right time a lot of the time. People were looking for somebody like me, whenever I was seeking to move. Having said that, I haven't had a job for 20 years. So, a new
You've
job,
got
that
one of the
is,
best jobs in television.
I think I'm aware I've been very lucky and I've had a pretty charmed existence from that point of view. But I think, at the end of the day, you've got to be able to do it as well.
Yeah. Otherwise, you would get found out. Yeah, you would. Of course. Yeah. Now, interviews, an important part of your job, and you've acquired something of a reputation as the interviewees fall out with. Quentin Tarantino just refused to answer one of your questions and told you, "I refuse your question. I'm not your slave. You're not my master. You can't make me dance to your tune." And Robert Downey Jr. just walked out on you and later on called you a syphilitic parasite. Shall we just take a look at the Robert Downey Jr.?
Oh, do we have to? Okay.
Still okay.
Therein lies the answer to your question.
The statement sort of sounds by itself, doesn't it? I mean, does that mean you're not a liberal, or that you came out of prison not being a liberal?
Are we promoting a movie? To me, the thing is that I'm certainly not going to backpedal on anything I've said, but I wouldn't say I'm a Republican or a liberal or a Democrat. I think when I was talking to the person who was doing the interview that day, and that just happened to be my opinion. That's the nice thing, is you can have opinions and they kind of change and flow.
Yeah, well, that's life and that's growing older, I suppose, isn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, you say we're promoting the interview, promoting the movie. I mean, obviously you're doing a promotional round of interviews, and that's why we're talking about the movie. But we also would like to talk a little bit about you, and I don't know how comfortable you are,
talking about yourself at the moment.
You have as much time as anyone else will.
Yeah, well, okay, well then let me just ask you a few more questions and you can answer them if you want to and not if you don't want to. Well, I think I've got 3 more minutes on our agreement.
Your foot's starting to jump a little bit. You better get to your next question.
The reason I'm asking about the past is that you've talked in other interviews again about your relationship with your father and the role of all of that in the dark periods you went through and taking drugs and drinking all of that. And I just wondered whether you think you're free of all of that, or whether that's still something.
I'm sorry, I really don't. What are we doing?
Well, I'm just asking questions. That's all.
Right. Bye.
Are you? I'm sorry.
It's okay.
Do you?
You feel okay? Just getting a little dance where you're.
No, look, I don't want to do that.
And with that, he was gone.
And with that, he was gone.
Tell me about that.
After the Tarantino interview, quite a lot of the studios were a little bit wary of
Did
doing
the Tarantino
interviews.
interview came first?
Tarantino came first,
okay.
the year before
Yes.
this.
Okay.
But I carried on doing a lot of sort of culture interviews and movie interviews and all the rest of it. Robert Downey Jr. came along, and I was told we had an interview with him next week, and I was like, okay, Iron Man, okay, fine. And 2 days before the interview, I think I got a call from the producer saying the pluggers are jumpy and they want to know what the interview's about. Normally, I don't respond to those sorts of interviews, questions, but I thought, well, okay, fine, they're a bit jumpy after Tarantino. I've no desire to have a row with this man, So I said, well, it's really straightforward. We'll do some of the movie and we'll do some on how he went from prison and drugs to being the most bankable movie star in the world, which is something he's talked about a lot in the past. And that was sent to them, and they obviously just never told him. And he arrived, and that's what happened. And he was very uncomfortable. Maybe I should have stopped. But then, I think, to be honest, as soon as he got a bit antagonistic, and as soon as he started sort of... I'd said, if you don't want to answer these questions, don't answer them. He could have just said, I don't want to answer them. As soon as he started getting a bit like, go on, ask your question, then I was like, okay, I'll ask my fucking question. And so, and so see what happens. But it was sort of... It's a weird thing, because social media has made that the biggest thing the most watched thing I've ever done.
Yeah.
And
if you search for you, that's what comes up first.
Yeah, and
Right, yeah.
it's kind of awful and depressing,
Yeah.
because it's such a little insignificant snippet of what I've done, but that's that's the way social media works these days.
You could begin to tell it wasn't going terribly well when he started looking sideways at his PR.
Yeah, I mean, he was looking at his PR,
looking
them
for somebody to dig
exactly.
them out. Yeah.
I mean, the thing is, that's not the first time anything like that's happened, but you don't hear about it. I mean, they tried to get us not to run it, and their bosses came in and sort of said, well, this can't go out. And I said, well, I think it will. Unless you get him back in here to finish the interview, that's going out as it happened. And they said, well, who can we ring? I said, well, you can ring the chief executive of Channel 4 for all I care. They'll tell you exactly the same thing. And so it ran. But, I understand it's happened before, and it hasn't, and it's been buried.
Was there a part of you that thought, this is great telly? He's walked out. This is really... This is going to make tomorrow's news.
Yes, with Tarantino. I definitely had that feeling as soon as that started kicking off. I thought this is going to be good. With that note, I really wasn't expecting him to walk out. I mean, I thought maybe he'll have a tantrum of some kind or get cross or something like that, but I wasn't expecting him to walk out.
Does he have a reputation for walking out of interviews?
I mean, no. I mean, certainly I wasn't aware of it, and I'm not aware of it since. But so no. I mean, I don't think I had time to go, oh, this is going to be good. But I mean, what I do, whether it's showbiz or politics or anything, I suppose I don't back down, and maybe to a fault. But You know,
is there a part of you that thinks if he's going to be difficult, so am I?
Yeah, certainly. And you know, and I kind of think, well, you know what? Don't come in here. Don't. I think also, to be honest, as soon as he said, "Are we promoting a movie?"
Yeah.
It's like, no, we're not fucking promoting a movie. You know, this is an interview, and we always make that abundantly clear. You know, we do. You do often end up interviewing movie stars when they are doing junkets, but we always do it in a separate room. We don't have the posters. We always make it clear that these are not junket interviews. We're not here to just talk about the movies. We're here to talk about, and you know, everything else. And with the vast majority of them, it's absolutely fine.
Oh, you won't let them put the post? Oh, good for you.
No.
Oh, that's very good. Oh, good. I wish the BBC would do that sometimes. Yeah, very good. That's excellent. Okay. So, what do you think? What do you think the PRs think they're doing?
I've no idea because they all have different responses. The Tarantino interview, the PR was laughing, and thought it was hilarious, the whole thing. With them, they were, you know, they were much more corporate. But so no, I don't know. I mean, I think, you know, it's as you can tell, it's not even something I really like thinking about anymore because I'm so bored of it. But
have you done movie stars since those two, since Tarantino and Downey? Oh yeah. Okay.
Yeah, no, and some people actually, you know, some people like it. I mean, I interviewed Scorsese.
Yeah.
Or Scorsese. I didn't realise until I met him that's how you're supposed to say it.
All right.
And they actually kind of chose me because of it. And when I went to Rome and met him there, and they sort of said, "Oh yes, you know, we like your interviews."
And is there a part in the Channel 4 News team now that thinks, "Oh, we've got another movie star coming up. Let's get Krishnan to do him"?
I think, to be honest, it's kind of usually it's whoever's on that day.
Right. Okay.
Because we have to plan them, you know, according to what day they're going out. So, you know, and I think a lot of people won't do me now. So, you know, that's an issue as well.
What a surprise. And of course you've had your run-ins with politicians as well. Jeremy Corbyn famously lost his temper with you. David Davis came close when you accused Theresa May of lying.
Yeah.
Do you deliberately adopt a confrontational style?
Not with everybody, no, and I don't adopt a confrontational
How do you
style
decide
with everybody.
with whom to adopt a confrontational style?
Well, it usually happens during the course of the interview.
Okay.
Well, I mean, it might happen if you're doing an accountability interview, you know, as we call them, where it's a politician or somebody in power and something wrong has happened and they are there to be held to account, and you're going to go in probably with a pretty tough question.
Yeah.
But a lot of the time, it's during the course of the interview. If you ask a question, you don't get an answer, or if they're obfuscating or avoiding it or lying or whatever it might be, that's the point at which you say, no, you know, you're not going to let this go. I mean, I never go into an interview with a list of questions that I'm going to ask in an order. I go into an interview with 2 or 3 things that I want to get out of the interview, and hopefully you get to the second and the third, but you don't always, because it depends how the first one goes. And you've got to listen to them and see where they're going. And if it's clear that they're not playing ball and that they've come on just to say nothing, then yes, it might turn a bit more confrontational and a bit more hostile.
So the political interview had its day?
No, absolutely not. I think the
politicians have got very skilled at blocking.
Yeah, they have. They
very
have.
Skilled.
But they're only, on the whole, good at blocking it for about 4 or 5 minutes. So I think what's happened is political interviews, the only political interviews that get anywhere are the longer ones. And so we are doing slightly longer interviews on Channel 4 News. And you know, different programmes do it in different ways. You know, some people have decided to be discursive, to not try and give people a hard time, to not accuse people of making a mess of things.
What might you call the Evan Davis approach?
I wouldn't put a name on it, but I mean, some people have. You know, there was a sort of a post-Paxman thing that happened. I don't mean just on Newsnight. I mean generally in broadcasting, where a lot of people said, you know, the confrontational interview doesn't work anymore. I just don't think that's true. It's horses for courses. Sometimes you need confrontation. You need to hold a politician to account in a pretty rough way. Sometimes you just need to try and find out information. And if they will engage with what went wrong, then there's no need ever to become confrontational. We certainly don't go out there to pick a fight.
Yeah. And part of the secret of Channel 4 News, I think, is you've got the time. you have got the time to do things and to explore in depth. And I think that hour-long format is a big part.
I mean, it's not trolling. I mean, if you go out trolling people, then
yeah.
You're really on a hiding to nothing.
Yeah. But it's become harder to get politicians to come and be interviewed.
It really has. Yeah, no, there's a huge crisis, I think, in politicians not submitting themselves for tough interviews. Because there are so many options now for them to do clips and the easier stuff that they can avoid pretty much everything. The Today programme's the only one that still regularly gets cabinet ministers on a news story, because that's where you go if you want to set the agenda. Otherwise, it's
they have more
is a sort of
than they've had in the past.
Yeah, no, and there are some who just won't do Humphreys, won't do certain ones.
Yeah. Are you friends with any politicians?
No, not really. I mean,
do you have a mix of them socially?
No, I mean, very, very occasionally I will meet politicians socially in a sort of a situation, but I'm not friends with politicians.
Have you ever had a politician round to dinner at your house?
I've had a couple of politicians round, not for dinner, but
just to be grilled.
Yeah, but no, not. I mean, once or twice in 20 years.
Yeah. Okay. Right. Is that deliberate, or is just you don't?
It's just the way it is. I mean,
it's not what you.
I find it. I do think it's hard to be friends with politicians. Some people are the complete opposite, and they, they make friends with politicians, and they lunch them, and they dine them, and they try and they try and develop a relationship with them. I think if you are, and that's a political correspondence approach. I think if you're a reporter whose job it is to go and find stories, then it's all about developing relationships with people. 9 times out of 10, when I'm talking to a politician, it's because something's gone wrong, and or you were trying to find something out. And if you're friends with them, I think it's hard to ask the tough question. There are very few examples that I have, but in the very rare occasions I have where you kind of know somebody slightly, a bit more than just on a, you've met them to interview them basis. It is much harder to give them a hard time, and if they've really screwed up and you really need to give them a hard time, I think it does change the dynamic if you're friends. So I don't seek friendships with politicians deliberately, and so that it means that I have a slightly different way of doing things to some of my colleagues.
Spin doctors, a necessary evil?
Yeah, I mean they are. I mean, if you're a politician, you've got to have a spin doctor. I mean, I don't blame spin doctors for what they do. I mean, they do what they feel they have to do, and I don't think they're necessarily the problem.
Do you have run-ins with spin doctors?
Yeah.
What form would it take?
A text message, a phone call, or just being turned down, being blacklisted effectively.
Yeah.
For a period of time, not getting an interview with a certain person for months on end, and it can be very senior. I mean, even David Cameron, before he became Prime Minister, refused to come on Channel 4 News for a period of months because of something or other we'd done, or a series of interviews that we'd done. I think it was a combination of me asking him about tax and Alex Thompson asking him about cocaine, and that kind of they just decided, right, we're not doing that for a while. We're going to punish them for 6 months.
Well, I can't imagine why you wanted to ask David Cameron about cocaine, but anyway, let's go on. Diversity. Is television still hideously white?
I wouldn't use that phrase, that Greg Dyke phrase, but there is a huge problem still, and I think we're only just starting to really understand what it's been about, because in many ways we've gone backwards. As Lenny Henry pointed out a couple of years ago, television in all sorts of ways is less diverse now than it was when I was starting out. When there was a much more deliberate, I think, attempt to grasp these things. There was then a period in which lots of bosses, who were all sort of, liberal, not at all racist in the traditional way, kind of sense, would go, well, we're not racist, we're trying to solve these things. Find me a good ethnic and I'll hire him tomorrow, but I just can't find them. And so it wasn't sort of deliberate racism from that point of view, but I think it's only now where, somebody was saying to me the other day, a boss was saying to me, why are we where we are? And I had to say, well, it's because you're a bunch of racists. and they go, what? I said, no, I know you're not really. You're not a traditional racist. It's just that you don't really mean it when you say you want diversity. When you talk about diversity, what you mean is I want a brown version of me, or a female version of me, and that's not really diversity.
Say more about that.
Well, diversity is acknowledging that people have different cultures and different approaches and different classes and different ways of speaking, and in a very middle class world of educated liberal people, it's very easy to pick off the ones like me who've been to Oxford and private school and speak nicely, and say, well, yes, that's great. It's much harder to find the ones who come from a more challenging background or educational background or speak with an accent or wear different clothes and say they are just as interesting to me to put on television because they're challenging, for a lot of bosses, or a lot of people in authority, because they're a bit different and they make people go, oh,
So it's not just about
they're
skin,
not like me.
not
And the
just about
point is,
skin colour.
you've got to be different. That's the point of diversity. It's not real diversity if it's just, a bunch of, black female, not Eton educated because they wouldn't be female, but privately
Beadles,
educated,
Benedict,
whatever
yeah.
people who speak nicely.
So
That's not diversity.
The Beatles.
Does it have a class problem?
Yeah.
Does television have a class problem?
It's everything. I mean, that's the point about diversity and equality, isn't it? I mean, it's race, it's sex, it's class, it's gender. It's sexuality, it's disability. All of these things have really got to be taken far more seriously than they are.
Where's the change got to come? At the top or the bottom?
Oh, everywhere. But I mean, you don't get real change until you have people in positions of power who can make it happen. I'll give you a very simple example. At Channel 4 News, we had a deputy editor until recently, who's now been promoted to Channel 4 commissioning editor, Shaminder Nahal, who came from Newsnight, actually. And Shaminder came to Channel 4 News with a very clear mission, which was, I'm going to make the discussions and the debates and the guests on Channel 4 News more diverse. And by that, her priorities, I guess, were gender and race.
Yeah.
And it took a boss to actually say no to things, to say, no, you can't do that discussion, because you can't have two white middle-aged men discussing this. Find somebody else, find a better cast, to the guest bookers and to people who were booking the guests, until we actually changed. And it took a few months, but it did actually deliver real change. And so it requires people in power to say, no, you can't do things the way you've always done things.
Have you experienced discrimination professionally?
I mean, I always used to say no, because I've never experienced, anybody in a work environment saying anything racist to me.
What do you say now?
But, it's very hard for me to. I certainly wouldn't argue I've suffered because of racism, because obviously, as we've already discussed, I've had a charmed career and I'm very lucky and I've got a great job. But how I've been viewed, I suspect, by people in authority, I imagine there has been.
Do you think it's helped you?
I'm sure it will have helped me at times, and it will have been a disadvantage at other times, because people have said, no, we've got one ethnic, we don't need another. And so, I'm sure race has been a factor in my career. Exactly how, I'm not sure. I can't spell it out. But because the industry is essentially driven by, posh white middle-aged men, and now some posh white middle-aged women, there's going to be some problems.
You saw discrimination as a kid. You described walking through Burnley town centre with your dad and being spat at.
Yeah.
What's that like?
When it's happening to you as a kid, that was just life. When I was a teenager or a young kid, you were aware of racism and the National Front and I grew up outside Burnley, which is quite a tense place at times, and there were very segregated communities there, and in a way I was lucky in that I came, my dad's a doctor, and we had, we lived in a posh house in the mostly white village. We were the only Asian family in the village. But if in the town, you had these very sort of segregated areas. You had Asian areas and white areas. And so I was lucky in all sorts of ways in that I was insulated from the day-to-day racial tension in those towns. But it didn't mean that, you wouldn't walk around town and be abused or shouted at, or in my dad, as I say, I mean, Burnley Town Centre, I don't know whether it still has, it used to have the shopping centre used to have a balcony around the top, and so you used to have kids who would stand around the balconies, and I walked across the main square with my dad, and somebody on the balcony spat at him. And so, I mean, was it shocking? I mean, it was outrageous, but I'm not sure it was that shocking in that was what happened. It wasn't the first time I'd been racially abused. So, and the language of racial abuse was pretty normal, even in a sort of ignorant, childish way, from posh kids who didn't really mean it.
Pay. I'm kind of guessing if you worked for the BBC, you would be on a list that was published, and because of Carrie Gracie, this of course has
fortunately I don't work
right
for the
back
BBC.
into the news. Is Cathy Newman paid the same as you?
I have honestly no idea what any of my colleagues are paid. So I don't know is the answer.
Shouldn't you know?
Should I know? I don't know. I mean, should I be paid the same as Jon Snow?
Do you think you should? You both.
To be honest, no.
You both do the same job. This is part of the argument, isn't it?
I think
equal pay for.
The answer is
jobs.
I don't know. I suspect Jon earns a lot more than me. I suspect I earn a little bit more than Cathy. Jon's done the Channel 4 News for 10 years more than I have. I've done Channel 4 News for 10 or 15 years longer than Cathy has. These sorts of differentials happen. And I think they're right, because I don't think television is a normal industry in which, there is a job and there's a rate for the job. It's a talent-based industry in which bosses have got to be able to decide who they want to present their programmes and who they think is the best, who they think is worth the most, who they think brings in an audience. There is an entertainment aspect to television. And you can't deny that. I think the reason this is, so I don't think all presenters should earn the same. You've got to acknowledge, experience, seniority, what you do. We've all got slightly different jobs at Channel 4 News. We all do slightly different things.
Does television have a male-female problem?
Oh, of course it does.
Yeah?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's got a male-female problem, it's got a race problem, it's got all sorts of problems. I'm sure there's an ethnic minority and a gender pay gap across the media. I mean, even though everyone's denying it. They'll all put out their statements over the next couple of months saying we've looked into this in great detail and we've decided that we don't have a problem. And it depends how you cut it.
Unreported World, it's a programme with which you're very closely associated. On Friday nights, you do quite a lot of reporting for it. You've done some memorable reports, Mexico, Cancun, quite recently. It's a programme you obviously feel strongly about. You must have been very disappointed that Channel 4 cut the number of editions.
We've gone from 8 programmes to 6 on the next series. And that's obviously not something I would like to, I would have wanted to happen. But we'll see what happens in the future. I don't think that's necessarily an end point, I think is the point. And I'm hopeful that, Unreported World is an incredibly successful programme, actually. And
it's a very important part of Channel 4's mission.
It's a very, very important part of Channel. I think it's one of the most important programmes Channel 4 does. And it does incredibly well online, it does incredibly well with young people, and it does incredibly well around the world. So I hope these are things that will be looked at by our new management.
I wouldn't say much for Channel 4's priorities, that one of the things it cuts is Unreported World, but 8 to 6, does it?
As I say, I think these decisions were taken a while ago, and we are now in a new era with new bosses who I hope will have slightly different priorities.
Are you hoping that the new bosses are going to be slightly more visionary than the old
Well,
ones?
Ian Katz started work today, so I'm not going to say too much. But
Okay.
but yeah, I mean, look, it's great to have somebody who's got a news background
But you're going to be lobbying him.
running the channel. Yes, I'll be lobbying him.
Good. Good. Right, I think it's time to get your questions, please. Let's see who would like to start off the questioning, please. Yeah, gentleman there, and I'm looking over there as well, please. Yes, sir. Sorry, I don't have a microphone, so please
That's
shout.
okay. I'm a great admirer of your interviewing technique,
Thank you.
and I wonder if you have any advice for those of us who are trying to do interviews in different ways, to hold your centre, to kind of keep your nerve. It seems to me that you're under massive provocation sometimes. I have in mind the interview you did with Dominic Raab about a month ago, where you quoted to him a whole lot of stuff he'd said. And he just said something like, "Oh, you're just willfully trying to nice try." It was, I mean, I felt incandescently angry to hear him say that, and I was curious about how you feel about that, or whether that you just take it on the chin.
Well, the interview you're talking about, actually, I was quoting the document. It was the it was the deal that they'd done over the first stage of the talks, and so I was very confident in what I was putting to him, and so I was going to be pretty doggedly determined to just keep going back to him. And yes, I mean, sometimes politicians will just say black is white, you know, and will say that's not true, and that's their approach. And it's a sort of it's a post-Trump approach to the political interview that some politicians are deploying, that they just say whatever they think they want the audience to hear, because some of the audience will just hear that. And I think particularly on Brexit, which is such a divisive topic, you know, you can say pretty much whatever you want from either side, and your followers, the people on your side, will agree with you. So my advice, I mean, or my approach, I mean, as I said before, I mean, I don't go into an interview with a list of 1 to 8 questions that follow on from each other. I go into an interview with 2 or 3 things in a 4 or 5 minute interview, or 5 or 6 things in a longer interview that I want to get to, and it depends what their initial approach is to the first question is as to where we go. But I've got a very strong sense of the points I want to get out and the questions that I want answered, and I'm not going to give up until I've had a really good go, you know. And I think that's the thing. I mean, that's why I sometimes get into trouble with the celebrity interviews, I suppose, and that my approach is I'm not going to be fobbed off with a sort of here's my stock answer, because pretty much every interviewee you do these days, whether it's a politician, a business leader, or an entertainer, has practiced their answers with a PR or an advisor, and so they've been asked all these questions once during the course of the day, and they've got a stock answer as to what they're going to say, and that answer will do for about 3 goes. The 4th go, it's starting to sound really thin, and that's why sometimes we keep on going, because if you keep prodding, that answer falls away and stops being persuasive, because it was only really designed for the kind of interviewer who will go, okay, thanks, we'll move on.
Who's the most difficult person you've interviewed?
Depends. I mean, sometimes it's, you know, Gordon Brown, when he was Chancellor, was really formidable, because he knew more than you did about the economy. And so
he did have certain set answers. He came in determined to say 3 things, or
yes, but also I think actually when Gordon Brown was Chancellor, he was slightly more engaged. You know, he wasn't as scared of the interview, and therefore he would engage, and you know, he really knew his stuff. So I think, you know, an interview like that was quite intimidating. On the other hand, you know, there would be interviews like Abu Hamza, who would just sort of rail and rant, and you had to try and cut through that. So I think those sorts of interviews are very challenging as well. Or David Irving, I interviewed David Irving after his court case. You know, somebody like that who's coming on with the aim of just kind of ignoring your questions and saying what they want to say. that those interviews are really hard because you've got to try and cut through it in a way that the audience gets it.
Saw a hand. Did I? Yes, sir.
Just shout, please, and go repeat the question.
Sorry, my name's Sanjay. Two quick questions. The first one is you mentioned in Cat started today. I was saying that when someone starts and it's their first day to buy them a drink, what happened on your first day, and why aren't you buying in Cat's drink? The second question was about...
Can we take them one at a time? Would that be all right? Yeah. So the first question is, why aren't you buying Ian Katz a drink? And what you're doing on your first day?
As a presenter, I always assume that it's the boss's responsibility to buy me a drink.
That's a good tip.
And what was the second question?
About your interview with Mark Thompson. So when Celebrity Big Brother race scandal happened, or the really
Yeah.
scandal was controversy, I remember you interviewing Mark Thompson. I believe at the time he was in charge of Channel 4.
No, well, it wasn't Mark Thompson. It was Andy Duncan.
Okay. But you did. I was going to ask, what's it like when you're interviewing somebody at Channel 4 that you might disagree with?
Was that about the racism on Celebrity? On
It was the Shilpa Shetty thing, I think.
Shilpa
Yes,
Shetty.
when
Okay.
Luke
Yeah.
was the chairman and Andy Duncan was the chief exec.
And the question is about interviewing people.
Interviewing your boss.
Your
I
own
mean,
boss.
I have absolutely the same approach, and I gave Andy Duncan quite a hard time, and asked him, what at the end of it, the rabbit punch question was about his £1 million payoff, and whether it was worth it. So no, I mean you can't. In a way, to be honest, when you're interviewing your boss, you have to be even tougher, because you're going to get a load of people saying, you backed off because he was your boss. So, and that's quite often why bosses don't do interviews. It used to be the case that BBC, but you'd see John Burt interviewed by Jeremy Paxman or whatever. I mean, Tony Hall doesn't do a lot of interviews these days with BBC presenters, and Channel 4 management don't do a lot of interviews with us. I mean, we empty-chaired them a lot through that. We were in a sort of slightly absurd position of quite often when the race row was a big story, saying we asked Channel 4 for an interview and they said no, because we are totally independent editorially of Channel 4. Channel 4 News is made out of ITN. We're in a different building. They can't ring up and tell us what to say according to the contract. So.
Yes, please.
Hi, you mentioned that you interviewed quite a lot of political people when you were quite young, and I was wondering, how does one go about being taken seriously as a teenager or a young person coming into the industry and being able to kind of hold your own, especially...
I think if you're serious, people take you seriously. I never had a problem. I never had a problem with anybody not taking me seriously. In fact, John Prescott, that first programme I did, he wrote to me a really nice letter afterwards, saying, thanks for having me on, etc., etc. I had no idea you were 18 years old until my daughter told me when I got home. And if I'd have known, I'd have been much more, brisk with you. I wouldn't have taken you nearly as seriously or whatever. So I think it's all about how you carry yourself. And when when I was young, I certainly acted a lot older, and I dressed older, and I remember Jim Gray, who was the editor of Channel 4 News, when I was wearing glasses and sort of going in that phase between not really liking to wear, wearing glasses and wearing contact lenses and all the rest of it. And he said, just wear glasses, it makes you look older. When I was 28, and he wanted me to look older. And someone will probably now tell me to take them off and get lasered.
So part of your advice would be for that.
Be serious. Just be serious.
Be confident.
Don't act like an 18-year-old who is, or however old you are, who's a bit intimidated. Just don't be intimidated, basically. I mean, you've got as much right to be there as anybody else, and that was always my approach. I've been given a job. It's my responsibility to ask these questions. You've got to do it properly.
Gentleman at the back.
Yeah, Christian, there's a lot of chatter around about the rise of artificial intelligence and robots.
Yeah.
Do you fear being replaced by a robot anytime soon? Perhaps more realistically, would you have concerns about reading bulletins that have been written by an algorithm?
I mean, I just wouldn't. I mean, yes. I mean, no, I don't have a concern about being replaced. I mean, I think actually all our experience from social media and the internet and what people are watching on Facebook, Twitter and YouTube is that people want original journalism by people they trust. And so we've gone through a period of seeing what works and what gets shared. And people used to think it was about clickbait and about just sort of stupid stories that people wanted to share. Total rubbish. What people share is the reporter in Syria, the reporter in Yemen, the original journalism shown doing something. My Unreported World in Mexico has had huge numbers of views on YouTube and on Facebook because people actually value people and people they trust telling them things that they can believe. And I think trust is a really valuable commodity in television news that it's very, very hard to reproduce with an algorithm.
Mexico program's a terrific program. If you haven't seen it, you should watch it. Yes, lady here, please. Yes, please.
Would Channel 4 apply the same kind of torturous impartiality rules that they're applying, the BBC is applying to Kerry Grace?
I don't know, to be honest. I mean, I would never dare, second guess what the boss is about to put out next as a rule. So,
do you think they're right? And for example, saying to presenters who say they support her that they can't report on the story anymore. Do you think that's an appropriate response?
I think it's really hard. I mean, we were talking about this beforehand, in that what's happened over the story is really interesting, in that we have quite strict rules about when we're allowed to talk to the media about Channel 4. I wouldn't be allowed to do this thing tonight if my boss and our head of comms hadn't said, yes, you can do it. So it's slightly out of control. So I can kind of understand why the BBC is going, oh my God, this is completely out of control. On the other hand, if you say nobody who has tweeted about this can read the news about it or interview anybody about it, I mean, everybody has. And most people are just saying, fair's fair. Can we just not be discriminatory? Can we just be fair to people? Can we just have equality? And I think I think if you say that, then I don't really see what the problem is, because I don't think that's a bias. I think a bias towards being good, I don't think people should murder people, doesn't disqualify me from interviewing people about murder. So I believe in equality. I believe in obeying the law on equal pay. Doesn't disqualify you from interviewing somebody about equal pay. But I think it's very difficult. I sympathise in a way with what they're doing, because they're obviously trying to shut it down. Otherwise, it's going to be completely out of control. But there is a madness in what's going on at the moment. I mean, this morning on the Today programme was beyond W1A.
Yeah, I saw a hand here, please. Yeah.
From an interviewee's perspective, if you're a business leader or a politician, if you do a bad interview, it can destroy your career. Have there been any incidences that you can recount where you've sort of known in your bones that someone is genuinely a nasty piece of work, and through the course of your interview have actually helped really expose that?
Reveal that.
Yeah, where you have gone,
excuse me.
I've actually nailed that person.
I mean, I hope that's happened a fair amount, particularly with politics interviews, where often the point of a politics interview isn't necessarily, they're not going to answer the question. So the point about standing your ground and asking the question the third time is to show the audience that you've asked this question every which way you can think of. This politician doesn't want to answer the question. We'll move on now. So you've highlighted that. It's quite often the point of the interview, or the thing that's revealing in the interview, isn't the answer. It's the lack of an answer, or it's the approach to an answer, or whatever it might be. And similarly, yeah, I mean, my approach to every interview is to try and reveal something, either in what they say substantively, what they reveal, or how they say it, how they approach it. And that might be about temperament, it might be, it might be all sorts of things. So, I think I first did that actually when I was a student, and I went to interview the president of Sri Lanka, who was notorious for having brutalised a section of the population, having sent the army into massacre villages and all the rest of it. And and my approach was not to be, angry and aggressive with him. It was to talk about what people had said and to keep at it for about 20 minutes. They were expecting a sort of a 10-minute interview, but I just carried on. that's often quite important. You know, ignore the PR saying you've got 5 minutes. You know, and when they start desperately trying to wind you up after 3 minutes, you just so I didn't see you. And so after 20 minutes, when he's getting a bit more irritable, and he then started to admit, he then started to say, yes, you know, well, they were doing this and they were doing that. What do you think? What do you expect me to do? We had to put them down. And I think that's the first time actually I sort of thought, oh, actually, you know, you can reveal things here by just carrying on at them.
Do you think you sometimes have to wind the interviewee up a bit to get at the real
Yeah, you do. I mean, I have said, you know, sometimes my job is to just be a bit of a shit. And not to be very likeable. You know, it's not my job to be liked by the viewer. And I know sometimes my interviews wind people up. And they don't like me because they say, why are you being mean to that nice person? And yes, sometimes my job is to kind of prod.
Yeah.
And keep prodding until you find the funny bit.
Yeah. Woman here, please.
It was just following on from the point about your beliefs.
Can you shout? I'm sorry.
It was just following on from the point about beliefs, and I suppose there was a lot in summer about sort of reporters and perhaps their political persuasions. I was just wondering what sort of weight you think viewers should or do attach to their persuasion.
As in, do you think we should be impartial, you mean? I mean, I think impartiality is absolutely really important.
No, actually, I mean, I was thinking from the point of view, I mean, I trained as a barrister, and from that you can have a belief, but you can still defend people.
Oh, yes.
And so I feel as though perhaps reporters could do more to say, well, actually, this is my political persuasion, but that doesn't mean I'm not going to give you a really hard time because of this. Or I was just wondering...
I don't think you should ever state what you personally think. Yeah. I mean, what I personally think really doesn't matter.
Yeah.
And my...
do you think then that at the moment, particularly because of social media and because of how exposed everybody is, then perhaps people then, you assume that someone is because of this, and so then...
No, people assume all sorts of things about me personally, Channel 4 News, Jon Snow, you know, the programme, you know, and by and large they're wrong. People assume because you'll ask a question in a particular way that that's your personal view. My job on Channel 4 News is often to attack from a particular perspective. But I always try and change the perspective. So the Dominic Raab interview that the gentleman was mentioning, I was actually sort of attacking him from a UKIP position. I was saying, you've caved in on this deal. You know, you promised, you know, an end to immigration, you promised this, you promised that, and you failed to deliver. And he didn't really know, he was a bit surprised because, hang on. In fact, I think he actually said, his first answer was, oh, well, this is a laugh, you know, Channel 4 News being all Nigel Farage. And because he couldn't quite get that, I'm not, when I interview you, I'm not interviewing you about what I think. I'm interviewing you about what I think is a way to reveal something about you. And representing the audience, asking, you know, what people at home think. And some people at home are over there and some people are over there, and it's my job to try and represent them all.
Woman over here, please.
Firstly, I'm going to applaud the fact that you do set your own agenda, and that's something we really enjoy and appreciate in Channel 4. And I'd like to ask, within that, what are the stories that you would like to tell that you really can't get to, and what are the interviews that you would like to do with individuals in the same?
I mean, this is the biggest issue, I think, for journalists now. That there are places in the world we can't get to. So I'm desperate to get back to Yemen. I've been to Yemen twice over the last 4 years, and I'm desperate to get back there because I think it's a terribly unreported scandal and humanitarian disaster, and keeping journalists out has been very successful for the Gulf Coalition because it's just, you know, hidden from the world what's going on there, which is dreadful. And there are lots of places like that we just can't get into. But you know, right now the most difficult one is Yemen. Syria's been a huge issue over the last 6 years of actually getting in to see for ourselves. You know, we were incredibly lucky in Aleppo to find a camera woman who was able to send us material out. We've currently got somebody in Idlib who's able to send us stuff out, but it's not the same as us going there and being able to present the news from there and talk to people there for ourselves. So that is a huge problem, but it's not just a problem in foreign affairs, as we alluded to before. I think the tendency these days now is for people in power not to come on programs like Channel 4 News because it's too risky for them. And so whether it's politicians or business leaders or anybody in a position of power, that's a real crisis at the moment, I think.
John?
Krishnan, when you were a 14-year-old stripling in Burnley, all right, going to a posh school, what made you think you could be on television? Because nobody like you on television. Was there?
No, well, at 14 I certainly didn't. And I didn't really even at 18, to be honest. Well, I mean, I went on television when I was 15 because I was in the audience of that show. What made me think I could do it? Probably long conversations with the then presenter of that programme, John Nicholson, who then became a great friend of mine, and who kind of said you could do it. He was the only one, the first person actually, who said you could do this. And then I kind of, then I had that sort of 18-year-old confidence. Oh, really? Yeah, I suppose I could.
What wasn't your background? Your background was GPs.
No, my background was, my dad was a doctor, and so I mean, I did science A levels rather than arts A levels, even though I'd probably been much better at doing English, politics, and history or whatever it might have been, because I was afraid that going into the law, which is what I really wanted to do, and be a barrister, was racist. I mean, I did work experience when I was 15 in some chambers in Manchester, and I went to court, and I was very interested in being a criminal barrister, and I met lots of lawyers, and I asked them about how easy it would be for somebody like me, and they all said, well, yeah, it's a pretty prejudiced profession, this, it's going to be tough, certainly you could do it, but, you'd be prepared to face prejudice. And so I think I chickened out of wanting to follow law because I was afraid of it. And so bizarrely, I then thought I could be a television presenter. Because the truth is, because people invested their trust in me. There was a television boss called David Martin who ran features at BBC Scotland, who offered me a job, and it was him saying you could do this when I was a week before my A-levels results coming out, that made me think, yeah, I could.
Did you have a broadcast hero when you were young?
Robin Day was probably my first broadcast hero. Yeah. And Robin Day, David Dimbleby, Jeremy Paxman when I was young.
Peter? And then Paul. Yep, please.
I think there's a new kind of interviewee around. Just over the last couple of years, and you faced some of them, you were talking about how people are trained to high heaven now, but they're trained to conceal things and come across as nice, or at least, agreeable, or put their message across. The alt-right interviewee, under which head I would say anybody who works for Breitbart, Sebastian
Gorka,
sort of mad little Mr. Miller in the White House, anybody like that, Katie Hopkins, is in the business of delegitimizing you and the channel from the word go. And it's completely fascinating. What do you do about people like that? Because they're beyond, aren't they? They're beyond.
Yeah, I mean, I think you have to take them on to some degree, but not give them a platform and not overuse them. There is a particular group of people who will come on and say pretty much whatever you want them to, or whatever they want to. They will just talk nonsense for the sake of it, and they, you can put them on, and it's probably pretty good telly. There's probably an audience out there for it. But I think you've got to just challenge them. You've just got to hold your ground on the facts. I did Gorka, and watch it and tell me what you think. I mean, I think we gave him a good run for his money. But you're right, there are times when they will just say things that are just designed to undermine you, delegitimize you, play to their audience about you, and then share it on social media and try and damage you. And you've just got to be very careful. You've got to be careful not to rise to it. Not to hit back in the same way. You've got to stick to your grounds. You've got to stick to the facts, basically. I think if you just stick to the facts and truth and keep asking them simple questions that they have to answer, not opinion. I'm not interested in your general opinion of the world. I'm interested in, did you do this or did he say that? Then you can get somewhere with your audience, and that you can reveal that they're not prepared to answer that question. But it is a new world we're in which they want people to stop believing us. Unfortunately, trust in television news is still remarkably high.
Here, please, and then there. Yep.
What have been the trends in your audience figures, and do you take any notice of them in terms of your editorial direction or judgment?
Trends?
Just a sec. Audience figures, are there? Do you take any notice of them? What are the trends, and how do they affect Channel 4?
The trends generally over the last 10 years, as television has been fragmented and come under pressure from the internet, have been, were broadly down. But now, Channel 4 News on television has stabilised and actually very slightly grown. So we've gone slightly back up. It's slight, but it's going right. But actually, what we've realised is you've just got to go where the audience is, and so our audience online is absolutely meteoric, and we've become one of the biggest news brands in Europe, if not the world, for news video. And now Channel 4 News, a lot of Channel 4 News has more viewers in California than it does in Britain. Simply because of we can see on Facebook who is watching where. And there's a lot of controversy about Facebook video and the way it's going, and how, what's a view and how long people are watching. But actually, you can tell all of these things. You can see how long people are watching and where they're watching in the world. And so, actually, we've got a massive young audience, a massive international audience, and so our audience profile has changed really interestingly.
What about terrestrial?
In our terrestrial audience, as I say, our terrestrial audience has sort of stabilised and gone up a bit over the last year.
So how many?
I think on a night-by-night basis, it will fluctuate between 650,000 as a snapshot on a bad night, and 850,000 on a good night, or 900,000 on a good night.
But is your online audience watching Robert Downey Jr. walking out on you and not watching Dominic Raab?
It was, but not anymore.
Oh, really?
So if you look at what people are watching, it's gone from. I think that's what we thought. I think we thought these sorts of things would be the things that would give us an online presence, and to some degree they did when those things happened. I mean, this is all years ago now. You forget. Tarantino was 3 or 4 years ago. I can't remember now. And Robert Downey Jr. was 2 or 3 years ago.
Yeah.
But now what people are watching is serious stuff. So they are sharing, as I say, Mexico, Yemen, Syria, the stuff that they can't get from every other source. Because there's so many people pumping out the rubbish and the skateboarding ducks and the silly stuff and all, the stunts. They come to us for news.
I saw a hand at the back. Yes, sir.
What are your aspirations? Do you think you'll still be Channel 4 News in 10, 20 years' time?
Yeah, you've been there quite a long time. When's
yes.
that time to move on? Yeah.
Where? Any ideas? My aspirations. My aspirations are actually not necessarily about where I work. It's the things I do. I would still love to anchor a general election. There are, presidents and prime ministers I'd like to interview. There are certain types of shows I'd like to do. I would still like to crack, a show that can do a mix. I think, various different attempts at serious unpacking of serious stories with some satire, comedy, and good humour hasn't really been cracked by anybody. For various reasons. Partly because we don't have the writers, partly because we haven't had the right characters fronting it. All those sorts of things. That kind of thing. I would still love to have a crack at that at some point in time, trying to do it properly. So there are those sorts of. There are shows that I would like to do, but actually, I think trying to predict anything 10 years from now is a mug's game. Whether Channel 4 News will exist as a television programme in 10 years, I have no idea. I wouldn't bet on it personally, but it'll exist in some form. But whether we'll all be watching television, I mean, I personally I don't watch television. I watch, television on demand. I watch downloads. I watch movies. I watch dramas. I watch box sets, and I will watch individual series of things that I know I need to. I really ought to keep an eye on that. That's interesting, or things that people are talking about. Do I watch television live when it goes out? Very rarely.
Have you ever thought about running something? Would you run the BBC? Would you run Channel 4? you clearly could do it.
I'd love to run something at some point in time, yeah. But it's not an easy transition. And I think the days when there were Melvin Braggs and Trevor Phillips and those sorts of people who were executives and on screen is a long time ago. And I think the boss class protect their jobs and their
about time to break
positions
it up.
very, very carefully.
It up then, isn't it?
Well, maybe. I mean, but not yet. I mean, there's a lot I want to do on screen yet, and I don't know whether you can do both at the moment. In terms of on and off screen. But I've always been interested in the industry and the way it works, and I've never ruled out crossing the floor.